on this Sunday morning. A Fox News alert. All eyes on London this morning after another deadly terrorist attack there. At least 7 people are dead, another 50 others injured.
This is, as we all know, the 3rd terrorist attack Britain has experienced in the last 3 months.
I was taking pictures of the Tower Bridge. I heard a loud noise behind me and turned around to see the white van crash into the guardrail, and it was continuing to go down the guardrail, hitting pedestrians. Everyone was standing in shock as to what had happened. We took a selfie right before. Directly afterwards, the photo is of several bystanders attending to a person that had gotten hit. People were mainly in shock. Such a quiet night like that, a terrorism event is not something you would expect to happen.
These attacks are not accidental. They know where the people are.
We will be doing absolutely everything in our power to try to stop such a horrendous attack as this.
London is under siege. The only way to deal with a terrorist siege is to respond with terrorism on those sympathists.
No reason to be alarmed by this. We are the safest global city in the world.
While we have made significant progress in recent years, there is, to be frank, far too much tolerance of extremism in our country. We cannot and must not pretend that things can continue as they are.
Good morning. We are all waking up quite somber this morning. I'm here with Pete Hegseth. Clayton Morris, good morning to all of you in London. Waking up to another deadly terrorist attack this morning. The investigation developing by the minute. Just moments ago, we are told 5 people reportedly arrested by police in raids in East London, possibly in connection to those attacks.
Yeah, the dragnet is wide this morning. This after 3 jihadists mowing down dozens of people with this van. You can see one of the terrorists laying there on the ground right before going on a stabbing spree in a nearby market.
Those terrorists, as Clayton said, like that guy, who see themselves as soldiers of Allah, shot dead by police, but not before killing at least 7 innocent civilians and sending 48 others to the hospitals, many of whom this morning right now are in critical condition. So, here to react to these developments as well as commentary from British politicians as they come in, our panel, former CIA senior intel officer Tony Shaffer, along with former commander in the U.S. Army Special Forces Lieutenant Colonel Michael Walls, and the founder of the American Islamic Forum, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, and Andrew Peek, former U.S. Navy commander and founder, and Andrew Peek, former intelligence officer as well. Thank you, all 4 of you, for being with us this morning. Lieutenant Colonel, I'll start with you. Your reaction, I believe we had you on before Theresa May spoke, or you reacted right out of her first time. Do you feel like those words are sufficient, and do you think they'll be followed by action?
Well, as Nigel Farage pointed out, we've been down this path before. So the question now becomes, is she really serious? And we need to pull away and look back at this from the perspective of how can we learn from this to stay ahead of it. President Trump has attempted a number of actions to actually help us stay ahead of the curve. And I'm with George Patton. The best defense is a good offense. We need to stay ahead of this. We've seen attacks here. We have not seen these type of attacks yet. But it's in our interest to allow President Trump to have members like us who are experts in this area to start looking at the lessons, figuring out a path forward. And as John Kelly, Secretary of Homeland Security, said, if we knew everything he knows, we wouldn't want to leave the House. Well, the idea here is that we want to continue to leave the House, need to get on the offensive, and prevent the networks that we now see springing up in England based on things that happened in the continental part of Europe. We need to stop that from happening here.
Yeah. Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, I couldn't help notice the disconnect between what we heard from Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London, and Theresa May, the Prime Minister of the UK. She says Islamic extremism, that's one of the first things she mentioned in her 4-part plan to get rid of Islamic extremism in the UK. Sadiq Khan said this is the safest city, one of the safest cities in the world, and we should continue and not be scared. Did you see a disconnect there?
Oh, absolutely. And, you know, many of us who have been doubting what his approach would be look to moments like this to see whether he will distance himself from Islamism, which is the nonviolent underbelly of all of these radicalizations. And sadly, if you look at his history before he became mayor, he defended many of the Islamists, etc. But many said, well, he's a liberal, he believes in gay rights, women's rights, etc. Give him a chance. Now, when his city, his country is faced at a point of war on the streets of his city, he continues to be in denial. And by the way, don't give Prime Minister May a pass. 6 years she was head of Homeland Security, and even today she said we will get tough on extremism. How do you define extremism, Prime Minister? It's Islamism. It's political Islam. They have a generation of radicalization. They've been working with the wrong Muslim groups in Britain. Even the soft but yet somewhat direct program of Prevent was minimized and lambasted by Islamist groups in Britain, and they ignored reformist groups and they marginalized them, and that's why they have the situation now that they have.
You know, we had Nigel Farage on just moments ago, the leader behind the Brexit movement. He said those very same words. Michael Waltz, I want to bring you into this conversation. We've heard now from Theresa May, we heard last night from President Trump, and we're hearing more and more from world leaders that we need to all work together, including the Muslim community. They have got to step up. How much is our own politics hurting our ability to be as strong as we can on the world stage fighting terror?
Well, look, you know, I think it's a great thing that Theresa May is finally going to take a tougher stance, whether it's on extremism or on how they approach counterterrorism, their counterterrorism laws writ large. But we can only play defense so long. I think what you have to really look at is a more offensive approach. The British SAS have a number of British nationals on their hit list that are training in Iraq and in Syria as we speak. We need to accelerate our efforts in Raqqa and in Mosul. But importantly, and this is why back in Washington, the strategic review in Afghanistan is so critical, is we can't just let those sanctuaries migrate back to Afghanistan or other places. We have to keep our foot on the neck of the leadership of these groups, and then we have to take a broader approach to, you know, at the end of the day, we're going to see these attacks continue unless we take a broader approach to countering the ideology of Islamic extremism.
Colonel Waltz, it's such a great point. You have to stay on the offense there. The longer the caliphate exists, the longer there's a motivation for these extremists. Andrew, but in order to go on the offense at home, too, the UK's got a terror problem, a radical Islamic terror in their midst. You don't want to play defense just with police. You've got to go on the offense. In order to go on the offense, you have to have intelligence, human intelligence. How do they go into these safe spaces, no-go zones, mosques, madrasas, elsewhere, where radicalism is festering, and actually get the intel to get rid of these guys?
Well, as you said yourself, the most important kind of intelligence in this counterterrorism situations is human intelligence. It's people who know the bombers, know the potential attackers, who know when they're acting weird. The trouble is you have to mix that with signals intelligence, things like monitoring communications. And those two things don't sit very well with each other, because for human intelligence, you need to engage with local Muslim communities who will often push back against the sort of surveillance efforts that the New York Police Department and others in the United States have had a lot of success with in the years after 9/11.
Colonel Schaefer, we heard that Nigel Farage saying, you know, he'd love to see warrants start to, you know, fall out of the sky, going after the 2,000 to 3,000 people who are currently on the terror watch list that they're currently watching. That doesn't address the other 22,000, though, that live in these sort of separate communities, these no-go zones. What do you think should happen? What will authorities be doing now over the next few days to sort of dragnet approach to this?
Well, as Judy said, look, they've been engaging with the wrong groups. I was chatting overnight with two of my British Muslim friends. One of them, the leader of the Association of British Muslims, formed in 1889, who have been fighting this behind the scenes, trying to prevent the radicalism, but they've been pushed aside by these other more radical groups. So we got to deal with those who want to help. We need to work with those folks who want to prevent these sorts of attacks. And look, I was in London just a few months ago as part of the Brexit discussions of how we're going to do defense together. And we need to work with the British hand in glove of looking at how we can learn and work with their special operations forces. And I'm going to say this, it's not going to be popular. We have to look at how we may have to do the same thing here eventually, to use our own special operations forces to prevent these guys from doing what they did there. We have to do this in a severe, direct, and persistent manner until these people go away. We cannot allow what happened in London, what happened in Paris to come here. But by doing that, we have to work with those there to prevent it, help them to stop what's going on there.
Right, Sam, we had a guest on earlier, and he said the way to get at these terrorists, you need to make them live in fear. You need to turn the cards right on them. Are they waking up this morning, Sam? Or do they feel like they're winning this morning?
Or Dr. Judy Zastrow, or Zuhdi Jasser, can you answer that one as well?
Oh, absolutely. You know, I believe any act that they do, as unsuccessful or successful as it may be, to them is a recruitment tool and is a tool that we are on the defense rather than them being on the defense. And by the way, what we're doing in Raqqa in northern Iraq is probably part of why they're feeling squeezed right now. But our fronts also include our streets in London and in America. So we have to put them on the defense. And that includes changing the narrative from being apologetic about victimization, stopping the self-imposed blasphemy laws of this nonsense concept of Islamophobia. That's why we're working with the wrong groups. We are so apologetic and on the defense. We need to be on the offense. That's how you mobilize. There's reports, by the way, that Muslim police officers who are moderate, don't wear hijab, and wanted to work with the Muslim community and reform were marginalized because of the influence of groups like the Muslim Council of Britain and other Muslim Brotherhood legacy groups that have destroyed the ability of us reformers and modernists of working to stamp out the precursors of radicalization.
Colonel Wells, we're here in Manhattan now. Folks will wake up and see what's happening in London and say this could happen here. Are we doing enough through our intelligence services, our military, our law enforcement to be proactive in this war that's being waged against us by Islamists?
Well, look, I mean, we've prevented another 9/11 style attack, and I think that's been the focus over the last decade. But these one-off, smaller, self-radicalized attacks are incredibly difficult, and I would not be surprised to see more happen like San Bernardino and others, and that's why I keep kind of banging the drum that we have to go after the ideology, as Dr. Jasser just said, and I think President Trump's speech over in Saudi Arabia was a great start, where he essentially put his finger in the chest of Muslim-majority governments and said they have to start tackling this from within, as from not only the ideology, but going after these groups in their own right.
Andrew, as a former advisor to the U.S. and NATO commanders in Afghanistan, we know that the surge worked. We know that these pinprick attacks by jihadists started to stop as a result of the surge. What would a surge look like in this regard?
Well, I think you saw a little bit of that after the Manchester attack. You know, the British government put the army on the streets to harden up some of the soft targets that looked vulnerable. But I think also it's important to point out that in Afghanistan, the surge didn't necessarily work. The violence went down for a time, but then the troops came home, and there's still an extremist problem there.
Right.
I think conservation of resources and a determination to fight this fight for the long haul is the most important thing. So we really need to look at what we're expending and how we're prepared to keep that going for the long run.
All right.
Well, gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us this morning. We appreciate a lot of expertise and a lot we have to wrap our arms around.
Really appreciate that.
Well, I think we'll be talking to a few of them as well later in the program.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
we have someone coming up that also was an eyewitness last night to help us better understand exactly how everything went out.
Meanwhile, what is the President of the United States saying about this? He's making a new push for his executive travel order at this hour, but the liberal media is going after him for trying to keep America safe. Ed Henry joins us live to explain this back and forth when we come back. And welcome back. You're looking live at London this morning here on the East Coast. And, of course, it's just afternoon there. You can see the police cordon on the left side of your screen. On the right side of your screen is where that van jumped the London Bridge, the pavement near London Bridge, and mowed down a number of innocent folks just walking home, enjoying their evening last night.
One of those folks joining us now by the phone, Scott Alexander, was a British master student, and he was, what, 50 meters or so from where this attack happened. Thank you for waking up this morning. I can only imagine how everyone is feeling a bit shaken this morning. Tell us what you saw last night. Tell us what happened.
Hey. Yeah, so my friend were walking down away from accommodation, like you said, 15 meters away from the where it happened, came onto the main street, and got onto the main street, and suddenly there was this gunfire behind us. Turned around, and it was this moment where everyone was walking normally, and then suddenly everyone started running. So we ran down the street for a bit in the panic, and then turned around thinking, oh, it's better to get back to our halls, get back to safety. And that's when I saw policemen running down the street with guns. We ran back to our hall, close to where the incident happened, and as we arrived in the hall, 3 policewomen ran around the corner screaming for us to get inside. Terrifying.
Scott, right now we're looking at live images. You may not be able to see them, but we see live images of the crime scene, at least on the left. But some are saying, why call it a crime scene? This is a war zone. This is an attack, an assault-style attack on the British people. How does it feel to you? Does it feel like a crime was committed, or does it feel like it was a war zone last night?
Well, I mean, the instant happened. It happened, I think, it took 8 minutes to unfold fully, and we saw the tail end of that. We saw the gunshot. But as it was unfolding, there was tons and tons of police around the area. Like I said, policemen followed us into the courtyard, screaming for us to get inside. From my bedroom window, I could see the corner of the main street, and from there was 20, 30 police cars just all crowding around the street. Every single entrance away from our balls onto the main street, full of police cars, police wandering around the area, police cordons, and they continued to push the cordons back. So originally it was just the edge of our road onto the main street, pushed back into the courtyard, pushed back further still later on.
Scott, we heard that people were jumping off the London Bridge in order to save themselves as the van was coming down. Did you witness any of that? And the other people were racing down into the underground, the London Underground, in order to get away from it. Did you witness that?
No, but what I did see was that I don't think I will forget a moment like that. It was pandemonium. Suddenly, everyone was walking normally, and then suddenly these gunshots, and everyone just stampedes down the street.
Wow. The mayor of London said that this is one of the safest cities in the world, and everyone should carry on. Do you feel that way this morning?
Well, I think there's a very big resolve in England to stiff upper lip. When these things happen, you just got to keep going. But I mean, particularly after the Manchester bombing and recently as well, there's been armed police wandering around the streets everywhere. I do definitely feel safe, but for this to happen super close to me, 20, 30 meters away from where I live. I don't know what you think.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, Scott, this is what, the third attack that the UK has experienced in just the last 10 weeks alone. Is it your sense that people are feeling on edge where you are? Do you see more of a presence on the streets with police officers? Have you sensed any sort of change recently?
Well, definitely since the Manchester attack. Like I said, I've never seen the armed police wandering around London in so many numbers as there are now. You walk down by the Thames, armed police over there. There's usually armed police at tube stations as well.
Yeah.
All the stations, all public buildings, there's armed police outside them. And I can just imagine now it's even more serious.
Scott, we are glad that you were safe this morning. Thank you for calling in.
That's right. Scott Alexander, English master's student in London. All right. Our next guest says we need to do 4 things. Theresa May laid out 4. He's going to lay out 4 to stop the spread of radical Islam. General Jack Keane, he's on deck, and you're not going to want to miss his.
All right, let's now bring in Ed Henry, Fox News chief nationals correspondent, as we're all just waking up this morning and trying to, you can't make sense of these things. We're trying to understand what happened and how we move forward.
Sure, and it started a couple of hours ago with Prime Minister Theresa May, who's facing an election on Thursday in the UK, saying we need to make major changes there to deal with this threat of radical Islam, and she laid out a whole plan to do that.
Too much tolerance of extremism?
Yeah, and we need to have uncomfortable conversations, she said. Meanwhile, over here in America, you see President Trump jumping on this just in the last couple of moments. He's been tweeting several times overnight. But the latest one, he says, quote, "We must stop being politically correct and get down to the business of security for our people. If we don't get smart, it will only get worse." Interesting, because he had earlier said we need to be smart, vigilant, and tough. We need the courts to give us back our rights. We need the travel ban as an extra level of safety. He also had tweeted support as well for the British people and the British government, saying the U.S. will do all we can. I think the broader point is that this president is dealing from a position of strength. He's been going on offense from day one, has faced nothing but an onslaught of criticism in the United States and around the world with this idea that he's a rogue, that, you know...
Politically incorrect.
Absolutely.
All these things.
And meanwhile, you now have Theresa May saying...
Sounding quite similar.
Wait a second. Maybe, without saying it directly, what President Trump has been saying is right, because she's dealing from a position where she's in a defensive posture. She has, as I noted, an election on Thursday where she has to face the British people. 3 terror attacks in just the last several weeks.
Well, and historically, I mean, put this in context, she ran the Homeland Security Department in in the UK for 6 years.
And so where have you been? And why haven't you had these uncomfortable conversations you're talking about this morning?
Yes. Why now?
Afternoon. Well, why now? Because there's been terror attacks, right? And it's fascinating when you look at the criticism this president is getting. There's journalists from CNN saying,
yes,
you know, president is piece of bleep, you know, because basically retweeted something the president, one of the tweets we just mentioned about the travel ban. And just saying these vile things about the president of the United States. A journalist, you see it right there.
This gentleman, this person, works for CNN and is a host on the Sunday show, I believe. And you can read it for yourself.
Look at what he tweets. Said, this piece of bleep is not just an embarrassment to America and a stain on the presidency. He's an embarrassment to humankind.
So for a journalist,
imagine if you tweeted that.
No, the outrage would be fierce, and yet you're not hearing criticism about this. No. And so people are not focusing on the facts. They're focused on their own personal biases. And if they actually looked at what's happening right now, we have to be dealing from a position of
strength. And that's one of the things that Theresa May talked about, this idea of this 4-point plan. We want to bring in General Jack Keane right now, retired 4-star general and former vice chief of staff of the U.S. Army, and who also has a plan. General, great to have you here on the show. You heard Theresa May earlier. Was it strong enough? How would your plan differ from what you heard from Theresa May this morning?
Well, listen, the real issue at the strategic level has been something that she's trying to get at here. And it's been actually a fundamental lack of political will and moral courage on the part of these European leaders, other leaders in the world, and frankly, our previous president for 8 years, because they have never faced up to the scale of this problem and what it truly is. Radical Islam has morphed into a global jihad. They're averaging about 30,000 kills a year now, up from 3,000 5 or 6 years ago. The number of countries involved have tripled in the last number of years, while these leaders have minimized the problem. The reality is that radical Islam is at war with civilization and the world order as we know it. But these feckless leaders are not at war with ISIS. That's the harsh reality of it.
General, what is the problem, though? I mean, we heard from President Trump about political correctness getting in the way. That is something he's talked about, as you know, from the early days when he first started running for president. And now it seems like Theresa May, other leaders, are recognizing that it's not about political correctness. This is about being a leader and fighting down terrorism.
Yes, you have to start with what you're responsible for first, and that's the security of your own people, and you have to educate them. This is an ideological struggle that will last probably at least for the half of this century that we're dealing with in the 21st century. So educate them on what is this ideology, what is its belief system, what is its characteristics. Isolate it in terms of the ideology so you can begin to separate it from mainstream Islam, which are God-fearing, loyal Americans, loyal British, loyal French people. Have that kind of conversation. Secondly, after you have that kind of conversation, tell them what you're going to do about it and where you need their cooperation. You've got to go into these Muslim neighborhoods, which are bona fide safe havens. To get at your question about political correctness, Abby, inside these neighborhoods are tens of thousands of sympathizers, hundreds of fighters who are willing to die, and you've got to have aggressive policing, but at the same time, and penetrate them intelligence-wise, like we did with the mafia. But at the same time, you also have to recognize that you got to offer them an alternative ideology. You got to reject it. You got to explain. The religious leaders, the community leaders have got to be given the courage to stand up and fight for the correct belief system. And you also, when May talks about an honest conversation, well, she's got to tell them why is unemployment in Manchester 12.8% and in the country it's only 5%? Why is unemployment in the no-go zones in France and Belgium 25 to 30%? These neighborhoods, these kids can't get into mainstream education, can't get jobs, and can't get out into the larger society of France, Belgium, and England as they do in the United States.
But General,
the third thing, let me finish. Let me finish. You asked me what I'm thinking. I'm going to tell you. The third thing is these policies of multiculturalism, open borders, and mass immigration, they're failed. They have got to be reversed. And then the last thing I'll tell you is safe havens, when they are established and these radical Islamists take territory and own it, when they do that, from that comes motivation and inspiration and direction for others to conduct attacks. That safe haven must be destroyed with a sense of urgency and passion. The safe haven in Syria was formed in 2012. That was their safe haven. We put our priority on Iraq. It was always the safe haven in Syria. It still exists today. 5 years later, from that safe haven, they have been providing motivation, direction, inspiration around the world, and we still let it exist. It should have been crushed by 2015. Military force, boots on the ground, NATO involved, Arab nations involved, U.S. combat troops. Crush it.
When a general says listen, you listen. Well said,
listen.
sir. Let's hope the feckless leaders in Europe are listening this morning and we can eradicate that political correctness. General Jack Keane, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Great having you.
Good talking.
All right, coming up, our next guest lives and works in London. She has a strong message for Prime Minister Theresa May. DailyMail.com, global columnist, you know her. Katie Hopkins is joining us next, and I have no doubt she's got some things to say.
First, while the recent attacks are not connected by common networks, they are connected in one important sense. They are bound together by the single evil ideology of Islamist extremism that preaches hatred, sows division, and promotes sectarianism. It is an ideology that claims our Western values of freedom, democracy, and human rights are incompatible with the religion of Islam.
All right, let's bring in Katie Hopkins now, a global columnist for the DailyMail.com, to get her take on the Prime Minister's speech a short time ago to the people of the United Kingdom. Katie, nice to see you this morning. How do you think her speech resonated? Do you think it hit the mark, or did it miss?
It missed the mark. I mean, we were relieved. I think I was relieved she didn't come out and say the stuff that our London mayor, Sadiq Khan, has been saying. Sadiq Khan has said, you know, we stand united. London is the safest city on the planet, maybe, that we carry on as normal. He's still saying the same old stuff, even as London Bridge has fallen down on his watch. But at least Theresa May came out and said, enough is enough. What she hasn't done, what she didn't do, is tell us what we need to hear. And that is that things are going to change completely. That tomorrow, 3,000 people on the watch list are going to be rounded up. We need to hear that 650 jihadis that return to the UK are going to be incarcerated and deported. And we need to hear that Saudi-backed mosques and extreme hate preachers and imams within those mosques are also going to be shut down and deported. That's what regular British people want to hear, what I want to hear. And it is not enough to say we will win against terror, because if this is terror losing, then victory is meaningless, because this is horrible.
Katie, you're right. I mean, Sadiq Khan did not mention radical Islamic terrorism. He spoke as usual. Theresa May did say we need to have uncomfortable, embarrassing conversations because there's too much tolerance of extremism, referring to the Muslim community. If the mayor of London, himself a Muslim, is unwilling to start that conversation, how is it going to start?
It is not going to start. We need to have much more than uncomfortable conversations. You know, we were told after the last attack just a few days ago by the head of UK's anti-terrorism unit. He said, look, we've rounded up the individuals responsible. Go out and enjoy yourselves. Well, you know what? Last night, that's exactly what people were doing. They were out in restaurants. They were out in bars. And a man from New Zealand was stabbed through the face, is now in a coma in hospital. An Australian lady had her throat slashed. Others were stabbed repeatedly with a 12-inch knife-bladed weapon. You know, our mayor here, Sadiq Khan, was sworn in on the Quran. He will not call this as Islamic extremism. He will not be honest about the problem we face. And until you can be honest about your problem, you have no hope of dealing with it. I can tell you, people are forlorn. You know, people say we are not cowed. We are cowed. We are broken. Regular families are forlorn that we are broken Britain. It is time for British people to stand up and demand action.
Yeah, we've got to get over the political correctness. I totally agree with you there. We heard that from President Trump in his tweet just a few moments ago. We had you on the show on Friday, Katie, talking about climate change. I mean, that's what we thought we were going to wake up and talk about today. That has been the focus where you are over in Europe, that for many people, that is the #1 issue for them. And here we are once again waking up to a horrific